Last month, in December of 2023, Venezuela held a referendum on whether they should annex the Essequibo region of Guyana. What in the world is this new territorial dispute, and are we about to see a war over it? Here's the quick background. The Essequibo is the largest river in South America between the Orinoco, which flows through Venezuela, and the Amazon. Spain was the first country to settle in the region. It claimed everything outside of Brazil, but most other countries didn't acknowledge Spanish claims. The Dutch also settled in northern South America in the territory that is now Guyana. In 1648, at the Treaty of Münster, Spain recognized the Netherlands' right to Guyana and other territories, but only up to the Essequibo River. At the beginning of the 19th century, the participants in this territorial dispute changed. The Netherlands signed over the rights to this territory to Britain, and on the other side, Colombia became independent from Spain in 1819, and then in 1830, Venezuela became independent from Colombia. So now, instead of Spain and the Netherlands, it was a question of Venezuela against Great Britain. But still, the question of the territory to the west of the Essequibo River wasn't a big deal. Neither country had really settled in this region. Nevertheless, in the 1830s, Britain hired a German-born naturalist named Robert Hermann Schomburgk to conduct a survey of the land, and he drew up a map with a line on it showing the extent of British control. This line became known as the Schomburgk Line, and it showed that Britain had a right to land far to the west of the Essequibo. Still not a big deal at the time. Venezuela disputed it, but Britain and Venezuela both agreed not to settle in the disputed territory, which goes to show, first of all, that there weren't many people settled in the territory already. There were native Indian groups that were settled there and had been living there the whole time, but in terms of Europeans, they hadn't penetrated into this land. And the fact that they hadn't settled there also probably shows that there weren't any resources that they wanted there, because if there had been, no doubt there would have been a massive settlement. That changed in 1876 when gold was discovered in the Essequibo region. Honestly, I've looked it up. I've been unable to find any evidence of a gold rush in the area at that time. The first mine apparently in Guyana opened in 1904, well after this dispute. And for a long time, the largest mine in Guyana was Omai, which actually was kind of in Essequibo, but it's kind of on the border along the river. So it's not like there were thousands of miners rushing into the Essequibo region, and that became the basis for dispute. Regardless, even if there was no actual mining going on in the Essequibo region, the knowledge that there was gold there did reignite the dispute. And Britain, at this point, claimed the Schomburgk Line as its border, and Venezuela broke off diplomatic relations. And in 1894, it appealed to the U.S. to arbitrate the dispute, hoping that the U.S. would rule against Britain on the basis of the Monroe Doctrine. European countries are not allowed to interfere in the New World. And the idea was that they would create a commission of 4 people, 2 representing Britain, 2 representing Venezuela, and this commission would come up with a fair solution. The crazy thing about this commission is Venezuela's reps weren't even Venezuelan, they were American. And not just any Americans picked from private life or low-level politicians. They were Supreme Court justices, including Chief Justice Melville Fuller. The idea that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would arbitrate a dispute on the side of a foreign country just still kind of boggles my mind. In addition, each country also had counsel to represent them before the commission. And again, the lead Venezuelan counsel was not a Venezuelan, it was an American. Former President Benjamin Harrison, which again seems crazy to me. So you would think that Venezuela, with 2 high-powered American justices on this commission and a lead counsel who is a former U.S. president, would be in great shape representing their interest. But no. Britain argued that Venezuela never had taken effective control over the territory up to the Essequibo, whereas the Indians, the indigenous Indians in the region that lived there, had treaties with the Dutch, and therefore Britain, who had inherited what the Dutch had more of a right to rule the territory. And lo and behold, in 1899, the Commission ruled almost entirely in favor of Britain. They gave them the land up to the Schomburgk Line with a few minor adjustments in favor of Venezuela. As a curious side note to this dispute, it gave rise to possibly the first propaganda film ever, the 1896 Vitascope film called The Monroe Doctrine. Apparently it was awful, but I am just fascinated that this is considered the first propaganda film, and even more amazingly, because the U.S. didn't even rule in support of the Monroe Doctrine, they actually ruled in favor of Britain. Now, because Venezuela had actually agreed by the Treaty of Washington in 1897, to be bound by the results of the arbitration, they were stuck with the results. But naturally, they never really accepted them. Like, how is this fair? This commission is crazy. So they objected repeatedly over the next 100 years. They objected before the United Nations in 1945. They had a military coup in the 50s, and the military dictator planned actually to invade Guyana before he ended up being overthrown. In 1962, again, they objected before the UN. In 1966, Britain and Venezuela actually reached somewhat of a solution. They accepted the Geneva Agreement, which called for a new commission, basically along the lines of the previous one, to settle the dispute peacefully. However, 1966 was the year that Guyana became independent. What Britain had agreed to prior to Guyanese independence was not what the Guyanese government agreed to. Naturally, they didn't want to give up their territory, and they refused to accept the principle of the agreement. They said, we have an arbitration award from 1899. It's still valid unless you can show why that's invalid. We don't need a new commission. This led immediately to some tensions with Venezuela. Venezuela, obviously a much larger country, much bigger military, occupied some coastal islands. They allegedly fostered support for a rebellion against the Guyanese government, which didn't pan out, didn't become a big deal. At some point, the two governments agreed to kind of let their claims sit in abeyance for a while, so things calmed down again. As another very interesting side note, the People's Temple under Jim Jones, where these Americans went down to Guyana and committed suicide voluntarily or otherwise, that occurred in Guyana in the Essequibo region. Probably a good place to be because there weren't a lot of people there around to check up on whether they were doing anything legitimate. So this issue sat in abeyance for a number of years until once again natural resources came into the picture. Oil reserves were discovered off the coastal waters of the Essequibo region in 2013, which Guyana immediately licensed Exxon to explore and exploit. And Venezuela, again, objected. They impounded a Guyanese vessel, and there was some tension there, no actual violence. In 2017, Guyana asked the International Court of Justice to rule that the 1899 award was fairly decided. The ICJ did decide in 2023, they agreed they did have jurisdiction, and they are planning to make a ruling sometime in the next few years at the speed of international justice, which is probably even slower than national justice. After hearing both parties, I don't know if Venezuela is going to actually represent themselves before the court or not. So what are we to make of this territorial dispute? First of all, there's not going to be a war. That's pretty certain. Venezuela is much larger than Guyana. Venezuela has 30 million people. Guyana, well under 1 million. So there wouldn't be any contest if Venezuela did attack. However, the U.S. has basically sided with Guyana. We've been escorting their vessels in the disputed territorial waters, and it's pretty clear that if Venezuela did invade, the U.S. would very likely help defend Guyana. So I think the likelihood of an actual war breaking out is pretty small, which is good. I find territorial disputes really interesting. In fact, the reason I got into studying the Peace of Westphalia in the first place was because I was interested in territorial disputes, and in particular Alsace. The fate of Alsace in the Peace of Westphalia is what drew me into it. If you've ever looked at books of maps and you see the shapes of the countries as they expand and contract, I'm fascinated by that, and I wanted to know, how did we end up with the map that we have now? Now, this particular territorial dispute in Essequibo is different than that in Alsace and most other territorial disputes that I've ever studied, because there's hardly anybody living in the disputed territory. In Alsace, the Germans were really upset because the people living there were German, and they were transferred to France, and they lost their German language. They all speak French now. They have French culture. And so for the Germans, it was a great national loss for the people involved. In Essequibo, there's no meaningful history of people in this area belonging to one side or the other. There are definitely native Indians living in this area, but they don't have any historical connection to one side or the other. The dispute is mainly about natural resources. This is especially important because, in my opinion, one of the major reasons for deciding which country ends up with a particular piece of territory is the will of the inhabitants. Do the people in the Donbass region want to be in Russia, or do they want to be in Ukraine? Do the people in South Ossetia want to be in Georgia, or do they want to be in their own independent country? Do the people in Essequibo want to be in Guyana or Venezuela? Well, as far as I know, no one has ever asked them, and my guess is that the reason for that is that if they were ever given a vote between Guyana or Venezuela, they would probably choose option C. They don't want to be under either one of them, which is something that neither Guyana nor Venezuela really wants, which is probably why they haven't been asked and why I doubt they will be. I'm curious if the International Court of Justice will make this a factor in their decision at all. I doubt it, because historically it's not been, and neither side is making claims on this grounds, but it could be. This is also an unusual case because it was actually submitted to a supposedly independent commission, and it was resolved. It's pretty rare, I think. I can't think of other cases. I'm sure there have been some where countries just allow a commission to decide what their borders are going to be. One of the reasons that you probably don't see this more often is evident from this case, which is that Venezuela has never really accepted it. People don't want to accept, countries don't want to accept that their borders have been decided by a commission unless they're confident the commission's going to decide in their favor, which Venezuela was actually, but didn't work out the way they wanted. Normally, countries care about territory intensely, and they're willing to go to war for it, and so they don't leave it to a commission. Very interesting to see if this remains peaceful and gets resolved. I was very interested to learn while researching this that there is another territorial dispute in Latin America also going on right now. Guatemala has long claimed a large part of Belize, or even all of Belize. This dispute has a similar history to the one between Venezuela and Guyana, and it is also, both countries have just appealed to the International Court of Justice to decide it, just in the last few years. So we may have two major court rulings coming up in this decade deciding territorial disputes in Latin America. And I find that fascinating. I don't know what the courts are going to decide, but I think it's going to be very interesting what they do decide and whether the countries in question agree to abide by the rulings.